FirstFruits and Shavuot, or what many refer to as Pentecost from the Greek. What are they? What do they represent, and how do we remember them? Let's talk about it. Hey, this is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. Today, we're continuing our teaching series, Torah 101, a series covering topics that give the basics and how we can all pursue the Torah as given by Yahweh. This series is for new believers or even sharing with those who may be interested in learning these topics. Today, we're discussing FirstFruits and Shavuot. Now, I have to tell you, that which we call first fruits really isn't first fruits in the Bible. It's the day the first fruits offering is made, yes. However, the day itself is never referred to as first fruits. In fact, if there is a day that's actually referred to as first fruits, it's the day of Shavuot. The context here in Numbers 28, verse 26, shows the 50th day of the feast is actually referenced as first fruits. So, though we traditionally call the day we make the first fruits offering first fruits, biblically speaking, that title really belongs to the 50th day of Shavuot. From what I've seen, there's really no actual title attributed to the day where we give the first fruits offering. Now, before we go any further, on a brief side note here, I'd like to bring some clarification to something. I've always heard there's 7 Moedim, appointed times, in Yahweh's calendar, those being Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, again, that's what we traditionally call it, Shavuot, trumpets, atonement, and Sukkot. However, that's really not true. Now, you're probably saying, Steve, what are you talking about? You see, there's actually 8 Moedim. Just as at the beginning of them all, we see how Passover is separate from unleavened bread. However, the Passover meal, eaten on the evening before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is closely integrated with unleavened bread. It's the first meal to be eaten going into the feast with no unleavened bread. But it's still not considered a part of the 7-day feast because it happens before the 7 days begin. Likewise, we see the last great day at the end of Sukkot, but it's really not a part of Sukkot. We see here in Leviticus 23, verse 33, how the command for Sukkot is to live in tents for 7 days, just as Passover is for 7 days. It doesn't say 8 days. It says Sukkot is for 7 days. Then we have the great gathering on the 8th day. So, it's apart, but it's separate. Then, a few verses later at verse 39, again, we see the distinction between the 8th day and the 7-day feast of Sukkot, showing Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, is only 7 days long. It's separated from the Holy Convocation at the 8th day. So in reality, we have a total of 8 Moedim, 4 at the beginning of the year and 4 at the turn of the year. I bring this out to only show that Shavuot isn't the middle feast like so many like to say. It's really the last feast of the opening 4 at the start of the year. I just felt that needed to be pointed out. So again, there really are 8 Moedim, not 7. 8, pointing to eternity, the time after the millennium. 8, pointing to the time when all of his people's hearts are circumcised on the 8th day. 8, pointing to the time when Yahweh dwells with his people on earth for eternity. Okay, moving forward. The day that's traditionally called First Fruits is when the priest is to make the wave offering of a sheaf from the first of the harvest. He's to take the cut sheaf, Thus, it's dead, and wave it before Yahweh. Thus, that which is dead is waving, as if it's alive again before Yahweh. This foreshadows the imagery of Yeshua. Though he was dead, he was alive again on first fruits. Thus, as Paul said, Yeshua was our first fruits at his resurrection on first fruits. Now, there are some who debate as to when the day of the first fruits offering is to be made. This is because of what we read in the account given to us in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 9. The Deuteronomy account says this day happens on the day we cut the grain. Thus, many say we have to wait for when the grain is ready to be cut. However, nothing in the Hebrew says the grain has to be ripe. It simply says it has to be new, meaning from the new crop. In fact, those who say it has to be ripe use the word abib for their defense. However, in the Hebrew, the word abib simply implies the heads of grain have formed on the stalks. It doesn't necessitate them having to be ripe. And regardless if they're ripe or just have the heads of grain formed on them, Leviticus gives us the exact time when we're to cut and bring it to the priest. That happens on the day after the Sabbath when the priest is to wave it. However, unlike the first fruits offering, at Shavuot, we're commanded to make 2 loaves of bread to be offered, as seen here in Leviticus 23, verse 17. The 2 loaves of bread given as a wave offering at Shavuot could symbolize the stone tablets containing the 10 Commandments, the words of Yahweh, showing the word of Yahweh is our true bread. Thus, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. I also see these 2 loaves representing the 2 houses of Israel coming back together under Yeshua in the new covenant. Again, this takes place on the 50th day, Shavuot, the day when the people entered into covenant with Yahweh. Shavuot means weeks, thus the Feast of Weeks, the counting of the 7 weeks, and the Hebrew actually says counting of the 7 Sabbaths. The Greek Pentecost means 50, for the 50 days in the total count. Yahweh said to count 7 weeks, Sabbaths, from the first fruits offering to the day after the 7th Sabbath, the day of Shavuot, the 50th day. In a sense, you can really say Shavuot is a micro-jubilee. You see, a jubilee is a 50-year count, the 50th year being basically a reset, a time where everything starts afresh and anew. In like manner, Shavuot is a 50-day count, a 50-day count to freedom. Those 50 days represent the time from when the day the children of Israel were freed from Egypt to the day of the marriage covenant at Mount Sinai. As noted in our short written teaching titled Shavuot Out of Egypt, the 50-day count to Shavuot started on the first day of unleavened bread. That's right. The 50-day count to Shavuot started on the first day of unleavened bread. That means the first day of unleavened bread was also the day we traditionally call first fruits, the day the first fruits offering is made. We see the 50-day count began that day. I know, it just doesn't sound right, does it? However, we know the covenant at Mount Sinai was made on the 4th day of the 3rd month. Knowing the 4th day of the 3rd month was the 50th day, the numbers don't lie. As you can see here, when you go back 50 days from the 4th day of the 3rd month, you land on the 15th day of the 1st month, the day Israel left Egypt, the first day of unleavened bread and first fruits. The command of when the day we call first fruits is to take place and to start counting is on the morrow after the Sabbath, or, as the English says, the day after the Sabbath, as seen here in Leviticus 23:15. In the case when they left Egypt, Passover fell on that Sabbath itself. So, the next day, the day after the Sabbath, was when the counting was to start. This shows us the example in how we're to calculate first fruits to Shavuot. We start counting from the first day after the Sabbath. Any and all interpretations in explaining how to calculate these 2 days have to line up with what Yahweh did here with his people when they left Egypt and came into covenant 50 days later. There's no doubt this is the 50-day count out of Egypt. And there's no doubt this is what first fruits and Shavuot represent. If any interpretation to the instructions Yahweh gives us in calculating these 2 days contradicts what Yahweh did here out of Egypt, that interpretation needs to be reconsidered. The Sabbath is the 7th day of the week, though tradition often uses the term high Sabbaths for the holy days where no work is permitted. The only annual moed ever referred to as a Sabbath in the Scriptures is the Day of Atonement, as seen here in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 32. Knowing the Day of Atonement is the only appointed time titled as a Sabbath day by Yahweh, the command to start counting the 50 days after a Sabbath to Shavuot has to be the weekly Sabbath. And we see here the 50th day lands after the 7th Sabbath, showing this is definitely discussing the weekly Sabbaths. The only way to have the 50th day land on a day after a Sabbath is to start counting on a day after a Sabbath. Thus, in calculating when to start the counting to Shavuot, it's to start on the day after the 7th day Sabbath in correlation to Passover. But why does Yahweh give us a calculation in how to figure when to start counting to Shavuot? I mean, why not make the command to observe first fruits be on a specific numbered day of the month, like Passover, unleavened bread, or the fall holy days? This is because of what it would mean for us in the future. When did hope become a reality for the Hebrews in Egypt? It happened the day they left Egypt. And when did hope become reality for Yeshua's disciples? The day Yeshua rose from the grave. Both of these days started the 50-day count to Shavuot. However, both Passovers were eaten on different days of the week. Yet, because of how it's to be calculated, both had first fruits on the first day of the week following their Passover. This is only made possible by Yahweh not locking first fruits into a specific numbered day of the month, but rather having it float. So it will always be on the first day of the week. This will always be for both first fruits and Shavuot alike. In this, we see how first fruits is the freeing from Egypt leading to the new covenant under Moses 50 days later. Likewise, it also represents our freedom given through Yeshua by his resurrection on first fruits, and we look forward to the coming new covenant through him, the prophet likened unto Moses. I've heard many say that Shavuot was fulfilled in the 2nd chapter of Acts when the Holy Spirit filled the believers. However, we see here in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 22 and 2 Corinthians 5 verse 5 that which took place on Shavuot in the 2nd chapter of Acts was simply a deposit of what's to come. A deposit is basically a down payment for what's coming. So, what's to come? The new covenant, the marriage of the Lamb as seen here in Revelation 19. That which is prophesied here in Hosea chapter 2, and that which is prophesied here in Jeremiah chapter 31. So, when we remember Shavuot, we're showing how we're longing for our wedding day to come. So, am I implying this is the day for the wedding of the Lamb? Well, I'm saying it's definitely a day we should be watching for it. That's for sure. Shavuot is a timing of the marriage between Yahweh and Israel. Israel said, "We will," in agreeing to the marriage covenant. This is seen in Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. Since the first wedding with this people took place on a Shavuot, doesn't it make sense that the second could take place then too? We know biblical history is cyclical, so this is definitely something to keep in mind. Now that we see when we're to remember FirstFruits and Shavuot and what they represent, how do we remember them today? As noted before, the commands for these days require the proper priesthood and the temple, or at least the tabernacle. So everything for these days that require those obviously can't be done today. However, we can do our best in gathering with other believers and remembering the commands for the Holy Convocation. There are no specifics given to us in what these convocations are to look like. Seriously, they can be something planned out with guest speakers and a band for singing worship songs. They can be Bible studies. They can be as simple as just getting together for a picnic. Or they can be a mixed combination of them all. The point is to try and gather together with His people in remembering what happened on these days and look forward to what they will be for us in the future. This covers the basics for these two important days for us to remember. For some deeper thoughts into these days, please consider our teachings, The Prophetic Significance of Shavuot, Images of Shavuot, and, as already noted, our written teaching, Shavuot Out of Egypt. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.